Hello, thank you so much for joining me this morning. The program will discuss the European Union General Data Protection Regulation. I'd like to briefly go over the program today. First off, we'll start with the top GDPR myths, and then we'll move on to how you can prepare for the GDPR until it kicks in May 2018. And we'll move on to other cross-border information governance issues, and in the end, if we have time, we'll answer some of the audience Q&As. Just to start off with the top GDPR myths, we would like to briefly discuss myths associated with the scope of the GDPR, how the GDPR will be enforced, and damage control once GDPR kicks in. And to go further into consent, I'll hand it over now to Andy.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. Yeah, the first myth, consent is a silver bullet. Yeah, that's wrong, obviously, but it's a lot being discussed. Everything can be justified with a consent. In a way, it's true, but there are also other means of justifying data processing under GDPR. The most important one probably is performance of a contract, and another one is balancing of interest, and consent is just another option equal like the others. Another myth, GDPR creates a EU-wide harmonized set of data protection rules. Yeah, that's something we all were hoping for. We were all hoping GDPR creates one uniform level of data protection across Europe, so international organizations have to deal only with one set of laws in all European countries when it comes to data protection. Unfortunately, this was not totally achieved. The European member states did not always agree on what to provide on the regulations in the GDPR, on the provisions, and so we ended up having more than 70 local so-called opening clauses in the GDPR. When you read the text of the GDPR, and I can strongly recommend reading it, especially the recitals, but also the text. It's partly self-explanatory, partly a bit difficult to read. You will read some provisions saying member states can provide for special rules on blah, blah, blah. These are the opening clauses, and we have 70 of them. We're putting together a list of all the implementation laws in the various countries. Germany was one of the first countries publishing and finalizing their law. And this will unfortunately lead to a situation where international organizations have to look not only at GDPR but also at local implementation laws. The most prominent example is data processing of employee data that can be subject to member state rules, which will be and can be quite difficult then for international organizations.
Okay.
Right. Thank you, Andy. Now, if Dorota can discuss a little bit about the applicability.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. So this is a common section of territorial applicability of the GDPR. So it has its roots in the traditional understanding of laws, that the law that applies to my company is the law in which this company is incorporated or conducts business. So the GDPR extensively widens the scope of applicability of the GDPR. This was meant to be an answer to the development of the technology and the fact that the data or personal data of data subjects in Europe is being processed widely by processors or controllers all around the world. So different companies from different countries have access to the data of people from the European Union. Therefore, the scope of the GDPR is much wider than just application to the companies incorporated in the EU.
So this is Cindy, and I'm going to talk about what GDPR and who it really applies to. I'd say when I talk to clients, this is the area they're most confused about, this idea of extraterritoriality. And that means that it, first of all, applies to a controller or processor who's established in the EU. So if you have any kind of office or business in the EU, it applies to you. It also applies to you if you do not have an office in the EU, but you're offering goods or services to individuals on European soil. So you could have a website where you're actively marketing kitchen supplies, and you're based in Brazil, and GDPR would still apply to you. It also applies if you're monitoring behavior of individuals in the EU. That's Article 3. So you could be doing some type of profiling or processing data. You do not have to even be storing that information. Just processing that information would put you in scope. The other area that individuals get confused about is GDPR does not apply to consumers only. It applies to living, breathing individuals, whether they are citizens, not citizens, employees, just residents, or they're even business associates. So you'll first want to verify whether your company is subject to GDPR and make sure you clearly understand your obligations. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
That's me. So the next myth is, we skipped ahead. Sorry about that. So the next myth is, and I've had clients say this to me, I'm already complying with EU data transfer regulations, such as Privacy Shield, et cetera, and my business is located in a country that has adequate security, so I should be okay on GDPR. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because the truth is data transfers, that is moving data, personal data outside the EU, is only one part of your GDPR obligations. And here's a list of the countries that have adequate protection according to the EU. They do not need a mechanism to approve data transfer requests, so that part is accurate. So if you are located in Argentina or Canada, et cetera, you don't have to deal with the data transfer request complexities. If you're not in those countries, then you will need to rely on legal means, such as binding corporate rules, EU model clauses, or regimes such as the U.S. Privacy Shield. And one tip that I'd like to share with everyone is a data map, which is critical to help you understand your data flows and data residency. Let's go on to the next slide. And that's Dorota.
Yes, and I think this is the myth that's most commonly associated with the GDPR, which is the fine. So whatever articles on GDPR are there on LinkedIn or other social media, they mostly associate GDPR with payment of enormous fines, ranging even to 4% of the global turnout, so that will be imposed on companies in case of a breach. Well, of course, this is another misconception, because the fines are there in the GDPR, of course. They're a part of a system that is supposed to protect the personal data of the data subject. However, what's not being spoken out as often as it should be about those fines is that they are just part of the measures, and a fine being imposed is just a final stop in a long proceeding aiming to discover what the infringement was and how did the controller or data processor being accused of this infringement, how did this entity allow such an infringement to happen. So the myth is that the fine will be imposed on every breach, which is not the truth. The fines are only one of the measures that the GDPR provides to impose the pressure on the controllers and processors to comply with the regulation. So what the GDPR does, it imposes corrective mechanisms. So one of them are the corrective measures of supervisory authorities. The other one is the fines itself. And the third one are the penalties that may be imposed by the member states. So a fine may be imposed in addition to or instead of supervisory authorities' corrective powers. what I would recommend you to do is I would review those corrective powers in Article 58 of the GDPR, because actually they might have greater impact on your business activity and on your processing of a personal data than the fine itself. Like, the fine is a payment of a fine is really like the last resort of a supervisory authority. But when you look at the corrective powers, you will see measures that even involve the ordering to stop to process the data. Or a supervisory authority may impose an obligation to erase the personal data being processed. And this might really have an effect, a very detrimental effect on your business. So what I would do is I would not think about those fines only, but I would review the corrective powers of the supervisory authorities and see what effect, if anything happens, if any breach is found out, what the effect they will have on my business, on my company. So if we go over to the next slide, please.
Yes, so Cindy here, and something that a lot of folks also don't understand, there is no grace period. I've sat in presentations with regulators who have said this over and over again. So it's not like GDPR currently is going to be extended as far as we know. The date is the date, May 25th, 2018. So you really want to start thinking about, if you haven't already, what preparations are you going to make and how are you going to start? And certainly starting with an assessment is something very key. And in a few slides, we'll go into more detail on how to get started. Let's go to the next slide. And that's Dorota.
Yes. Could you move to the next slide, please? I don't see it on my screen.
You're on. Yeah, it's on certification right now.
Yeah.
Certification will solve all our problems. Yeah.
Yes. Which is a myth, of course, as well. So another misconception concerning personal data processing under the GDPR is that once a company, regardless of if it's a controller or a processor, obtains the certification or adheres to the code of conduct, then this means that they are absolutely compliant and are safe from any proceedings by the supervisory authorities. Well, which is not the truth. The purpose of certifications or codes of conduct is to provide a middleman, a middle person, an entity that would issue such code of conduct or would issue these certifications and supervise how the companies that obtained them are complying with the GDPR. So this is supposed to ease the job of supervisory authorities, but it is also supposed to make the market easier in such a manner that when you see a company you're dealing with and you know that it is certified or if it adheres to a code of conduct, you know that it has taken some measures to protect the personal data that it processes. However, the fact that you have obtained a certification or the fact that you adhere to a code of conduct does not mean that you are absolutely immune from being accused of alleged infringement of the GDPR. The regulator, the supervisory authority, as well as the entity that has issued this certification or has granted has published this code of conduct, they may still go after you as well, and they may tell you to stop using the certification as you are no longer complying. So a certification, a code of conduct is not a silver bullet. It is very helpful. It makes it much easier to demonstrate compliance, but it doesn't mean that if you are certified, you are always compliant with the GDPR. However, the fact is that the supervisory authorities, when they are finally imposing a fine after a long proceeding, they are taking into consideration whether you have been certified or whether you have adhered to a code of conduct or not, and it may be a mitigating circumstance when it comes to the calculation of a fine that you are supposed to pay. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and that's also the last myth we want to discuss today. And Dorota already tackled it right now. The myth you read sometimes: breaches are fined with 2% or 4% of the annual turnover of the organization. Well, yeah, that's basically true. That's the maximum fine, but it's the maximum fine. And there are a lot of other means of authorities to conduct investigations into possible incompliances and also to put consequences on incompliances. I don't want to comfort you and put cushions here, but for example, in the UK, there were more than 17,000 cases in 2016, 2017, and only 16 of these cases were really fined. That's in the UK. It might be a bit different in other member states, but very similar. And even those cases are not fined with the highest fines. In Germany, for example, currently the highest fine is 300,000 euros, and this high fine is imposed only in rare and limited cases. And the authorities say, yes, this is the threat, and in a very, 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 very extreme case, we might impose such a fine, but usually authorities start with, as Dorota said, talking, investigating. The important thing is to fix incompliances, to avoid data breaches, and then as a last resort, authorities might impose a fine. So with the myths, and then handing over to Jimmy for the to-dos.
All right. Thank you so much, Andy. Now that we know some of the top myths associated with the EU GDPR, I'd like to take a deep dive into the specific requirements and how companies can prepare for the May 18th deadline. And Cindy, if you can just go into GDPR readiness, that'd be great.
Let's go there. So next slide, please. The next two slides, I'm going to cover some of the highlights of some recommendations on what you should be doing to prepare. And this is also based on what we've been seeing with clients, what works and what doesn't work so well. So first is understanding the obligations. What are your specific obligations? Making sure you enlist your legal team or legal counsel to understand the implications of the obligations on your organization. Next, that I cannot underscore enough, is creating a cross-functional GDPR team that represents all aspects of the businesses. Lately, I have noticed a trend which is privacy and compliance are working on initial assessments around legal obligations, and they're not including IT and security soon enough in that discussion. So what happens is it takes many months to automate and create a lot of the tooling and implementation underneath, and if you don't involve them soon enough, they're going to run out of room to implement. So think about including your chief data officer if you have one, or the individual who runs analytics, marketing, human resources, your chief information security officer, your security function, in addition to the individuals you're already working with. You'll want to consider whether or not you need to appoint a data protection officer. I believe we'll be going into more detail on that. And start now in understanding what data you are storing and where it is located. And for that, you'll need to go beyond just a high-level data map and understand down to the data element level the data that you're storing and the risk of that information. And that will drive the implications and the controls. You'll also want to review privacy policies and statements and revise your policy privacy notices. If you haven't changed them lately, that's certainly a good opportunity as well. Look at how you're managing consent and choice, because consent is an important part of GDPR. And then look at how you are managing data subject access. How do you access that information on an individual, provide it, correct it, provide opportunity to have it erased, and then also make sure that you only hold data as long as you need to, and you implement data retention schedules. And you provide evidence of all your activities, because you will need to document all of the work that you are doing with GDPR, It's not good enough to have a policy. You have to actually demonstrate the practice. Let's go to the next slide, please. If you could, there we go. So next is documenting your privacy compliance activities. As I mentioned, you'll have to document everything. Review those cross-border data transfers. We talked about some of the myths associated with data transfers that you'll need to think about. And start now in implementing and documenting appropriate security measures. Decide what controls you're going to use. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a few minutes. Training employees is also very important, and the more you can do that in an automated fashion, provide training modules, and get everyone involved now, you'll be ahead of the game. You'll also want to develop audit capabilities and processes and create repeatable processes. GDPR is not a one-time exercise. It is a sustainable program that will include things like privacy and security by design, the way that you approach new systems and services, creating breach response and notification protocols because you have 72 hours to report a breach to the regulator. And the last but definitely not least is obtaining executive sponsorship and budget to support the changes. It does take an investment. However, you can leverage this investment for other activities such as digital transformation, which also requires you to know and understand the data that you hold. Let's go on to the next slide.
Yeah, one more you need to look at, which partly overlaps with some of the topics we just heard, is looking into the data processing agreements. That's something authorities had a close look already before GDPR, and it also, of course, is a hot topic in context of the discussion of international data transfers, Privacy Shield, and EU model clauses. So the task is get your data processing agreements with IT providers and other processors in place and in compliance with Article 28 of GDPR. Those of you who are familiar with the current rules in Europe on data processing agreements, the rules do not change too much. But Article 28, and if you read Section 3, sets out the specific content that needs to go into this data processing agreement. So it's important that you check your existing agreements, whether you have this or not, and otherwise change them. As a new rule, you don't need any paper or signature as opposed to the current rules. So data processing agreements can be concluded by click-through or similar practices, which will make life much easier, especially when using technology. One topic that is open and is a really interesting question is the international data transfer. So what if you have a data controller in Europe? So your organization is based in Europe, and you are using a non-European IT provider who is not privacy shielded. Usually you would then use now the model clauses, EU model clauses processors. And the question is, do you need to top them up with more details on Article 28? Likely yes, but we have not heard an official statement by authorities yet. That's the situation on data processing agreements, and moving on to the international data protection governance.
Yes. So when you are starting to get prepared for the GDPR, the good thing and the good news is that if you have been compliant with the 1995 directive, then what you need to do now is build upon on this directive. If you have documentation, if you have your data flows in order, then what you should do now is just compare in what degree and what extent the GDPR changes and widens the obligations that you had in the directive from 1995. However, if you don't have any documentation yet, or if you haven't been subject to the directive, what you should start with is conduct this internal audit, carry out this data mapping, and see what kind of personal data do you keep in your company, and how is this data going around. And by going around, it's not only about your main establishment, but also review your other offices in other cities. If you're a multinational company, do exactly the same exercise in other countries and see the data flows, the number and types of data that you are processing. So prepare this kind of inventory of the personal data that you have, because what you will start with later is going to, you will need to check whether you really need to process the data, whether you have a legal basis to process the data. An example that is quite common and typical is that if, for instance, you have conducted a marketing campaign a couple of months or years ago, and you have collected email addresses that you don't need anymore. So verify whether there is a basis for you keeping those emails or whether you should delete them. So apart from making the inventory, see if you are obliged to keep an official record. And this is an obligation which is imposed by Article 30 of the GDPR. So in case a company employs more than 250 employees or deals with sensitive data or is involved in high risk when processing the personal data, in such cases the companies are obliged to maintain the record. What I would recommend, however, is to keep such records even if you are not obliged to, because this will help you out in terms of any questions from the data subjects, in terms of any questions from the data protection authorities, and might make it easier for you to certify. So when you show to third parties that your personal data is conducted, it's held in order, it's going to make it much easier for you to work on those data afterwards. What you should also do is document the legal basis that you have for processing of the data. As Andy said, it's mostly consent, and can be consent, and can be the carrying out of a contract with the data subject. It could be your own legitimate interest. But what you should do is you should verify whether you really have a legitimate interest to process this data, whether you have a legitimate interest, for instance, to process somebody's data that might be considered sensitive data. What you should do elsewhere, and what you should do during this audit is to verify the technical and organizational measures that you involve in processing of the personal data. The GDPR does encryption of the data. However, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and you should really do this like thinking, what kind of IT measures do you keep? What kind of technology do you have involved when storing, for instance, the personal data? What are the risks? Whether you transfer any personal data to third countries, whether it's kept in a cloud environment. It's a lot of work, but you really need to have this work performed from the scratch and at the beginning of your getting ready for GDPR. Otherwise, you might skip some elements, some data that are processed, and it might turn out that you will have a data that you collect and you don't even know about it. Or, for instance, you let this data to third parties and you are not aware of that. What comes to my mind as an example is this your bring your device policy, where employees can bring their own devices and, for instance, keep the personal data processed by the controller on their own computers or laptops or cell phones. And this is a potential risk. So when you conduct this audit, this internal audit of the processed data, you need to bear in mind all kinds of situations when the data can go to somebody else other than your employees. So next slide, please. Okay, so the category of a processor is very important when processing personal data. It's an entity that processes personal data on behalf of a data controller. So it might be an IT company that stores the data in the cloud. It might be a bookkeeping company that keeps the records of the employees and their salary details. So, as Andy said, the GDPR imposes obligations on the content of a contract with such data processors. But what you, as the controller, are going to be obliged to, it's going to be your liability to make sure that you choose a processor that complies with the GDPR. So whenever you employ a third party to process some data on your behalf, you should make sure, and you really should put it in the contract as well, that they employ the necessary technical means to keep your data, the data that you outsource, safe. Otherwise, this might also be a breach on your side if you have provided the personal data to an entity that cannot keep them safely, that cannot guarantee it. And this is the way in which the certifications come handy, because it might be just easier for you to select a processor that has been certified. It is a proof that they have done an audit and obtained a certification. So thank you.
Okay, let's talk about data subject access requests. Another area that I find IT implementers are really struggling. And the question that I ask to them is, how will you be able to provide all personal data within 1 month? That is the obligation. Well, the first is you're going to have to know where your data is and what you're storing in order to fulfill a DSAR, where it is, what it is, and be able to pull that together for an individual. So, you know, Mickey Munns is Henry Michael Munns III is Henry Munns. They're all one person. How do you figure that out? Well, that's about understanding who a data subject is and the practice of master data management. You're also going to think about how many you get today, how many requests, and prepare accordingly. I'd recommend estimating an uplift percentage and looking at whether you'll be able to satisfy those requests manually or you're going to need to implement automation such as case management. You'll also need to produce audit trails. So think about how do you document these requests coming in? How do you document the requests being fulfilled? The other point I want to make that is very much neglected is that identity management and multi-factor authentication are absolutely critical for fulfilling data subject access requests. Think about the opportunity if you're a hacker having one-stop shop to get all this information on an individual. It would be really easy to impersonate someone if all the security questions you use are things like, you know, what was your high school mascot? What high school did you go to? Things, you know, information that is easily obtainable. So think about how you can implement additional security controls around data subject access requests. Let's go to the next slide, Dorota.
Yes. The decision of a company whether to appoint a data protection officer is going to be very significant, and it will influence the further processing of personal data. So the GDPR implements the position of a data protection officer who is this like intermediary between the controller and third parties. In certain situations, this data protection officer is obligatory. And what you might see on the slide is that the provisions are very general, and there is a lot of room for interpretation whether you will be obliged to appoint a data protection officer or not. So public authorities are obliged to appoint one. But whoever is monitoring personal data on a systematic and large scale is also obliged. So if you track your users and this is a part of your business model, this might be a reason for you to appoint a data protection officer. As well as if you are any sort of healthcare business and you process sensitive data, you will also most likely be obliged to appoint a data protection officer, which on one hand is a very good solution if you will appoint such a person. Next slide, please. Because A data protection officer is somebody who has an extensive knowledge of data protection law. So he or she is going to be an expert in the company in terms of handling and processing of personal data. You might, if you're a group of companies, you might appoint a single DPO for all of this group of companies. It doesn't have to be an employee of a company. It can be a contractor. The DPO can carry out other tasks. However, you need to make sure that there will be no conflict of interest possible, because the point of appointing a DPO is to make this person as independent as possible. And GDPR states directly that the DPO reports only to the highest management level, so he's directly under the board, which, again, should make such a person immune from any internal pressure in the company in terms of compliance, in terms of reporting to the supervisory authorities, in terms of ordering to conduct certain actions, in terms of software quality. So this person is very independent, has a very strong position in the company. So as I said, the DPO is some sort of an intermediary between the company and third parties. So he's the contact person for data subjects. The information about a DPO is going to be published on the website of a company that has one. The supervisory authority is going to contact the DPO in terms of any question. He's going to be the face of the company in the contact with the supervisory authority. In regard to the everyday operations of the company, the DPO is going to give advice. He is going to inform the employees about data protection issues, and he or she will also monitor compliance of the company in terms of personal data protection. Therefore, the need of this person to be highly independent. So this should be a very interesting job, and I think it's very much recommended for a company to appoint a DPO, even if they are not obliged to. So next slide, please.
Yeah, another to-do for controllers and processors is, I think that's the right slide here, is to prepare and make available to the authority, if they request, a so-called record of processing activities. That's an obligation for controllers and processors. Also, processors only have a limited obligation, so the content of this register for processors is unlimited, and basically processors can pull the content of the register from their data processing agreements. As a sporty approach, you might even say the data processing agreement is sufficient, but it is recommended to have a separate register and have the data therein. Controllers' obligations are wider. Processing register must contain, for example, identity of the controller, all the types of personal data, the purposes of processing, the categories of recipients, processor recipients or controller recipients, retention periods, IT security measures implemented. So there's a long list of items that must be included. Again, those of you who were dealing with European data protection laws in the past might be familiar with it. For example, in Germany, we're well accustomed to this obligation, not in that detail, but we know what it is. In other countries, there was often a filing requirement to authorities. For example, if you implemented a whistleblowing hotline in the Netherlands or in Austria, you had to, and still have to right now, file this with the authority and provide similar information that has to go into the data processing register. This is, in my observation, the step where many organizations are with their GDPR readiness at the moment. They are starting with the data mapping. They're starting, as Cindy said, they're starting to compile the information on what is the organization doing, what data are we handling, and this information is the basis for the further GDPR readiness, and the next outcome usually is the processing register. On the next slide, we've provided you with a link. This is the first official recommendation by a European authority how data processing register for controllers could look like. You also have a link here, and we will share the slides with you so you can use the link. OneTrust has, the original language version is in Belgian language, and there's an English translation by OneTrust. And this is something I recommend you have a look at to get a feeling, especially of the degree of detail of your processing register. That's a point where I see a lot of clients struggle. So they do data mapping, and they identify 400 different processing operations within their organization. And then they're saying, well, what are we doing with these 400 processing operations? Now, do we now need 400 records? Yeah, one for each process. And the answer is yes or no. My practical first answer is 400 is a bit many. And here in the Belgium, you see, for example, what they suggest for HR. You see all the subcategories. So for HR, you would have a processing register for personal management, task management, workplace monitoring, etc. So that's the degree of granularity the Belgians suggest. It, of course, it depends on your organization, how big it is.
And Andy, that's a great
feeling.
Sorry to interrupt, Andy, and that's a great example. I believe that's a great resource, but we still have lots to cover. So, Dorota, if you may briefly discuss certification of processors, that'd be great.
Okay, so this is a part of a presentation concerning vendor management and outsourcing, including the processing of personal data. So in your procurement process, when you as a company are employing, outsourcing, or vendors who will render services on your behalf or for you, what you should add to your procurement process, apart from the experience of a vendor, apart from the price that you will need to pay for their services or products, you should now start taking into account their qualifications in terms of personal data processing. So you should verify what sort of technical and organizational measures do they use to protect the personal data when they are processing. You should also impose an obligation on them in the contract to document how they are processing the data, what type of data they have, and what's they should report all the breaches to you, and it should be all put in the contract. So there will be no way for the processor not to do any of these duties when they are processing the personal data. So as we said earlier, the GDPR provides the processor the ability to certify. So when you as a controller are carrying out the procurement process, it will be very useful for you to pick vendors, pick service providers that have obtained certification in terms of personal data processing or in terms of, or have adhered to a code of conduct. Remember that you as a controller are liable for outsourcing of processing of personal data to an entity that will be able to do it in a manner that's not going to infringe this processing. So when you have your procurement process in the company, it's going to be an advantage for your company when you select processors that are certified and have adhered to a code of conduct. So make sure to place the data processing in your procurement criteria list when you are selecting vendors. Next slide, please.
Let's take a few minutes and talk about some of the technical controls to help you in your GDPR readiness program. One of the most important ones is encryption. Encryption may offer you a safe harbor. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll explain that for those of you who are not in the legal profession. What does that mean? We're not talking about U.S. safe harbor, which was previously a data transfer regime, but we're talking about safe harbor against needing to report a breach. GDPR Article 32 essentially says that you need to employ appropriate technical and organizational measures according to the risk, and it mentions pseudonymization and encryption specifically. This is the only two controls mentioned in GDPR. Pseudonymization is de-identifying information such that you need additional information to re-identify it, and certainly encryption falls in that category. And you'll notice Article 33 states that you may not need to notify a data subject about a breach if the data has been rendered unintelligible to any person who's not authorized to access it, such as encryption. So that is quoted directly from Article 33. So encryption is something you definitely need to consider. Let's go to the next chart, and I'm going to talk in more detail, very briefly, about security of processing. You know, the first stop with readiness for GDPR in the technical world, as I mentioned, is understanding the information you have. Information governance techniques are excellent in helping you to automate this, whether that is classification, tracking your taxonomy, tracking your data map with perhaps an information governance type of catalog. But then when it comes to controlling access, security of processing is all about protecting information according to the risk. It should say to the risk to data subject, by the way. I noticed a short typo there. And what I'm showing you here is this idea of a security immune system, which is just like the human body where the brain or central nervous system works with the other parts of the body to help detect and respond to threats to your health, whether that is getting a cut, a cold, or breaking a bone. So we think of security orchestration and analytics as the centerpiece that helps coordinate all the information from the other security disciplines and gives you visibility into what is a real threat, whether that's monitoring your mobile devices or cloud platforms, securing access to information such as the data subject rights information, or ensuring that you are monitoring the network for threats. Let's go on to the next slide, please.
Okay, what the GDPR does, it extends the scope of information that you need to provide to data subjects when you're processing their data. So if you have been compliant with the 1995 directive, what you might think about is reviewing the notices and updating them in compliance with GDPR, as the scope is greater of the information that you need to provide. So what you need to provide is you need to inform the data subject what sort of data of a subject you process and what you are doing with them and whom do you outsource them to or provide them to, and whether you are conducting any transfers. But what you should also do when you are conducting the data audit and when you are reviewing for how long you have been processing the data and how long do you want to process the data, it's a good start for you to when you are drafting the notices, because you will need to provide the data subject with this information for how long are you going to process the data. And as this example with an internet, for instance, game or contest that you have organized a couple of months ago and you are not needed, you don't need it anymore, you should inform the data subject that the data is only going to be processed for the term of the content and for the time of giving awards, and basically that would be it, and you are not going to use it anymore for any other reason, unless, of course, the data subject has given a consent or you have other legal basis to process the data. So what you should do is you should review your currently used notices on your website, in your documentation that you provide to data subjects, such as contracts or any sort of order forms or other company communications, and you should update specifying the information that's required by the GDPR. And when you are doing it, make sure that you use very simple language. Avoid using legalese and illegal jargon. Just write it as clearly as possible so it would be easily comprehended by the data subject. And when you're preparing the notices, when you're preparing the documentation to the data subject, always bear in mind that the individual should have control over their personal data that they are processed. That is processed. So it's not only about the privacy by default principle, but it's also about the fact that the individual should know that they can access the data. They have a right to demand deletion of the data. They have a right to demand the rectification of the data. And they have the right to just transfer this data to somebody else due to the right of portability.
Thank you, Dorota. Could you briefly also move on to the certifications by accredited bodies?
Yes, so the certification of the accredited bodies will be used by companies to demonstrate compliance. The accredited bodies will obtain their accreditation to provide such certification or to issue code of conduct just after the GDPR kicks in May 2018. But when you are applying for this certification, be informed that it does not relieve you from any liability, as it's not only the supervisory authority, but it's also this body that gives the accreditation certification will be able to tell you to stop using the certification or be able to state that you are not adherent to the code of conduct anymore. So what's important with certification is that it's granted only for a limited term, just to make sure that the certification is valid and it's not that a company has obtained certification, but then after some time just has stopped to comply with the GDPR. So basically that would be it. So next slide, please.
Let's talk about data protection impact assessments really quickly. They are required when there is a high risk to rights and freedom of natural persons, in other words, the data subject. There's other conditions documented in Article 35.3, and frankly, it's good business practice for privacy by design. It needs to be repeatable, automated where possible, and my recommendation for best practice is embed the DPIAs into your project approval processes. Next slide.
Yeah, just briefly on data processing agreements, we mentioned this already. There is a to-do now because putting in place or amending data processing agreements will take some time because you need the other party to negotiate. So look into your agreements now, whether your data processing agreements with your service providers, IT providers, and other processors meet the requirements of Article 28. If not, amend them. Look out for templates by authorities. They are slowly coming out in various languages, so this will make life a bit easier than having to draw up a new template for yourself.
All right, thank you so much. That was great information. And we only have time for a few questions, but I'd like to start off with what we discussed briefly earlier about the EU-US Privacy Shield data transfer framework. If anybody can jump in, if let's say you're a company that has self-certified as being Privacy Shield compliant, how much overlap are there between the requirements of Privacy Shield and GDPR? So if you're Privacy Shield compliant, how much more work do you have to do for the GDPR?
A lot. How about that? That would be my non-technical answer. A lot, because that's just data transfers. It has nothing to do with your policies, your practices, how do you manage data usage, et cetera. So Dorota and Andy, your remarks?
Yeah,
I think
I
that
agree.
it's a long road. Yeah, I totally agree.
Well, then what about for other frameworks like the APEC cross-border privacy rules?
Very similar, I would say.
Yes.
They're there is a certain overlap, and I mean what you need for all of these measures is get an overview, get governance in place, get an overview of data flows and data you're having. So you save time, but it's not a full overlap.
I see. And just to end things on just a speculation, we've been hearing lots of news about Brexit. How does Brexit affect GDPR planning for any UK-based companies or companies dealing with UK citizens' data?
Well, the companies, the Brexit will not take place until GDPR starts to kick in. So the UK is going to be a part of the GDPR before Brexit for some time. And a lot of companies that are established in Great Britain will be subject to the GDPR anyway due to the territorial applicability we've been speaking before. And furthermore, the UK is going to establish privacy laws that will be more or less similar to the GDPR.
All right, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for your time today.